Hi everyone, and welcome to this survival webinar. I'm sorry that we started a few minutes late, but we have 5 different speakers from 5 different countries joining us, so I think it's not that surprising. So today we're going to be talking about the horrors perpetrated against Indigenous peoples and local communities in the name of conservation, and why it's so vital to decolonise conservation. And we're also going to be looking ahead to why 2023 is going to be such a critical year. Thank you everyone for joining us today on all the different platforms that this is being live streamed on. That includes TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube and Twitter. And many thanks to Groovy Gecko for making this possible. My name's Sophie Grig, I'm a campaigner at Survival International and I work on both our Decolonise Conservation and our Uncontacted Tribes campaigns. During this webinar we're going to be looking at what's wrong with conservation and its dominant form, the colonial fortress conservation model, and at some of the conservation challenges that are coming up in 2023. So why is 2023 a critical year? Of course, every year is critical for Indigenous peoples and local communities who've been evicted from their lands and who are still facing threats from violence from rangers and guards abusing their rights. And we'll hear more about the impact of conservation on the Maasai and other Indigenous peoples during this webinar. But 2023 is going to be critical because the 30 by 30 plan, the plan to protect 30% to turn 30% of the planet into protected areas by 2030 was approved in December at COP15, albeit with language that's supposed to protect Indigenous people's rights, but we've seen time and again how that language is already incorporated in some policies, but conservation abuses continue anyway. So as a result of the decision on 30 by 30, 2023 will see the start of a massive push to create new protected areas and expand existing ones over the next 7 years, and with all the evictions and abuses that this will entail. 2023 will also see an escalation in the demand for carbon offsetting projects and other nature-based solutions as polluting companies and governments try to meet their net zero targets. And this is going to be another huge Indigenous land grab. On a more positive note, it's also a critical year because of a new draft US law that we hope will set an important precedent in stopping international funding of abuses in the name of conservation. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. So we'll be looking into all of these things in the upcoming hour and a half, and we'll be taking all the questions at the end and once the speakers have all had a chance to talk. So if you have questions and comments, please write them in the chat box or in the comment section in whatever platform you're watching this on, and we'll try and get through as many of them as possible. And if you want to be kept up to date with Survival's campaigns and to find out what's happening and how you can take action to support Indigenous peoples, you can subscribe to our emails. And the link to subscribe is pinned in the comment section where you are. So we're very happy to have 4 fantastic speakers joining us for the webinar today. We have Mordecai Ogada, Yannick Ndoyo, Fiore Longo and Abdourahamane Ly. Mordecai is a carnivore ecologist and conservation scholar from Kenya who's been involved in conservation policy and practice in Kenya and other parts of Africa for almost 2 decades. In recent years, he's been exposing the policy problems and prejudices that underpin conservation, particularly in the Global South. These issues form the central theme of The Big Conservation Lie, a book he co-authored with John Mbaria, and I urge you to read it. It's a fantastic expose of what happens in colonial conservation, and it's available on Survival's website. Mordecai also consults for Survival International on the impact of conservation practice on the lives and rights of Indigenous peoples, particularly in Africa. Yannick Ndoyo is a Maasai activist and campaigner for Maasai rights in northern Tanzania. He's the managing director of Traditional Ecosystems Survival Tanzania, and he has extensive experience in the conservation sector, including as a project officer for the German Frankfurt Zoological Society. He also has an MSc in Biodiversity, Conservation and Management from Oxford University, so he has a lot of experience of conservation from both ends. Fiore Longo is a research and advocacy officer at Survival International, and she's the head of our Decolonise Conservation campaign. And she has visited many Indigenous communities in Africa and Asia who are facing human rights abuses in the name of conservation. Abdourahamane Ly is a Guinean animal rights activist based between Nigeria and Rwanda. He has a background in international trade and Sino-African cooperation and is passionate about animal rights, climate justice and Indigenous rights. We're delighted that he and all the other panellists are able to join us today. I will also speak briefly about the devastating impact of tiger conservation in India on the lives of indigenous peoples, and also about the draft US legislation on conservation funding. And once again, if you have any questions at the end, please enter them into the chat or comment section on whatever platform you're watching on. So please let me introduce you to Mordecai, who will give some background and an introduction to the problems of colonial and fortress conservation, and highlight the rising problem of the blind acceptance around the world for injustice and violence in the name of conservation.
Thank you very much, Sophie, and thanks everyone who joined us. What we are facing today is the creation of a bogeyman out of a crisis that's very real. The current global climate and biodiversity crisis is real, and its importance cannot be possibly be overstated. But we have to always remember the origins, because the origins of this crisis is a few centuries of capitalist extraction, exploitation, and consumption patterns. That's what has depleted our natural resources. That's what has polluted our environment. That's what has resulted in the high levels of emissions and greenhouse gases, etc., that are causing climate change, global warming, whatever term you choose to refer to it by. However, this crisis has now been used as to create a bogeyman, vilifying and criminalizing the populations who live with the natural resources in the areas of the world where they're still intact. These are the so-called mega diverse areas, conservation areas, the ecosystems we all admire so much, the Congo Basin, East African rangelands, the Amazon, etc., etc., including the seascapes. But we have now reached a stage where we are deciding as a global community that we all want to own. We all want to own those areas and take ownership of them from the custodians who them since memorial. And this requires money and requires violence. Now, when we're talking about decolonizing conservation, we talk about the origins of current conservation structures in colonialism. And we must read our history and remember that colonialism was not a political initiative. It was a capitalist initiative. People left certain countries to explore the world and look for other places because they needed resources. They didn't need to just travel. They wanted resources including timber, ivory, minerals, jewels, gold, etc., etc. And this is what drove colonialism. So the precursors to the government colonial offices were trading companies. Like in East Africa, we had the Imperial British East Africa Company, etc. Congo was a business belonging to Leopold personally. We had the Imperial British East India Company that was involved over trade in heroin, etc. So this was what drove the cruelty of colonialism, not politics. People's hands were chopped off in Congo because they wouldn't meet the rubber collection quotas. This was a capitalist initiative. So when we understand that capitalism is behind the climate crisis and behind cruelty, we must extend that understanding to get the message that capitalism cannot now present itself in 2023 as the savior of environment or the people who own the solutions. They are the problem. So when we find things like development of tourist trade as a reason for conservation rather than a by-conservation, which is what it should be, we have a problem. When we have the loosely used terms like nature-based solutions, carbon trading, green finance, green this, green that, green the other, these are capitalism, and this is what drives the cruelty we see. Tourism and carbon trade, etc., is the cruelty that we witness whether in northern Tanzania, whether in northern Kenya, in Central Africa, and in the Amazon, so many other places around the world. It's driven by capitalism. The crisis we face right now is that conservation interests have become slaves to their capitalist financial backers, because conservation has become a business. And we have actually created what are money laundering methods like carbon trade and carbon finance and all that. These are money laundering methods because it's money changing hands without products going in the other direction. And it's become a very lucrative, untaxed business that has enriched many people around the world. It has to be defended using violence. So as we go into the 30 by 30 era, when we want to have 30% of the world are protected areas, one of the things we have to look at is the definition of protected areas. We can't do it with the current definition we are using. The COP15 meeting in Canada brought in all sorts of language, but even the country that hosted it is still dealing with terrible atrocities against their indigenous populations. So countries, at the very least level, continents must look at their own objectives, aspirations, and targets. We cannot have anything that fits the whole world, because those of us who still have biodiversity cannot be held to the standards set those who destroyed all of theirs. This invariably leads to violence and a new form of colonialism. The UN and global bodies are very well equipped to deal with cruelty and violations by nations, but the UN is not equipped to deal with cruelty and rights violations by non-state actors like NGOs. So the citizens, the countries individually must wake up and keep a close eye on what's going on, so that we keep the welfare of our people intact, keep their rights respected, and let them continue with their livelihoods that have protected our biodiversity for so many years. It is no longer a climatic issue. It is not a biological issue, a chemical issue. It is a human issue, and it needs to be looked at holistically. We cannot have a biodiversity crisis that allows us to create a humanitarian crisis. We have to do better than that at this stage of civilization, if I can say that. If we are civilized, we surely must do better what we are proposing under the UN. And our countries must do better. The UN itself must actually take a more proactive rather than following position on these issues.
Thanks so much, Mordecai. That's so many important points there. So if you're just joining us, welcome to the webinar on decolonizing conservation. We're going to have questions at the end, so please put any questions into the comments or chat section on whatever platform you're watching on, and we'll put as many as possible to the speakers at the end. We're now going to go to Yannick and Ndonyo, but before we do, we're going to show a video of Maasai people being fired at by security forces in Loliondo in Tanzania in June last year. And this is just one example of the horrific violence being perpetrated against indigenous peoples in the name of conservation. Yannick, a Maasai activist, will talk about what's happening in the video and also why global initiatives must stop supporting this sort of dangerous colonial conservation.
Thank you very much, Sophie, and everyone for joining and for following this conversation. The video you've just seen is exactly what happened in June last year in Loliondo, northern Tanzania, when the government decided it is time to create a protected area out of village lands in an unprecedented manner, by bringing military and paramilitary police onto village land without any announcement or without regard to any law. And so as this was one morning, and you can see and hear live shots of bullets, and the government was creating and is creating a protected area or a conservation area. And like what Sophie said and Mordecai, this is just one example of many incidences like this where governments and states create protected areas out of violence. And there's no any understanding or common ground created between peoples or communities and the government when conservation areas or protected areas are created out of their lands. So what happened in the video after the invasion of the state troops? The people are evicted, and the rangers and the police are kept over guard over that land, and no access is no longer permitted for either grazing or for whatever reason the community wants on the land. And this is completely wrong, because indigenous peoples and local communities have for centuries occupied and utilized these lands for cultural reasons and also for economic reasons. And to take land away just like that for any reason, conservation wise or otherwise, is unacceptable. And so what is happening right now, for example, people are forced to become poor, people are forced to become refugees, and conservation itself is not happening. It is rather tourism, and there's a confusion between if it is whether conservation is an objective or it is tourism. And this is all colonial. The mentality, the attitude, and the approach is all colonial, because the indigenous communities, local peoples, know better how to protect and take care of the land naturally and traditionally. And colonial education, colonial motives are imposed to create protected areas so that capitalism can get opportunities to flourish, tourism can get an opportunity to be practiced, and it has nothing to do with conservation. And for me, the perpetuation of this kind of conservation in the long run is going to collapse, is not going to be able to serve any sustainable aims that people in the world wish for. And it is time that, because I mean, creating a conservation area through military means you have not created enough sense, enough understanding, enough common ground between the occupiers of the land and the governments. And in the long run, because that is going to collapse, it's going to serve any purpose. And it is time to stop going to the COP conferences and go and come down and speak to the people, so that both of you can be able to learn from each other. For example, the education that is being provided to the people or to the administrators, the managers of conservation areas, is completely contrary to what traditional conservation is all about. They feel that nature should be without people, but there's no nature without people. And the people who better can explain that better are local communities and indigenous peoples. And this colonial kind of conservation, which is being funded by conservation organizations, bilateral governments, cannot be done elsewhere except only in the developing countries, which is completely wrong, because it is taking hostage of the powerlessness of these countries and these governments, and it is time this should stop. And so, from that example in Loliondo, which is a picture of almost everywhere where conservation or protection of these areas is taking place, The people have been made poor, refugees, and the government must stop receiving pressure from conservation organizations. Likewise, conservation organizations and government must stop pressurizing governments to do this kind of conservation or protection. They must stop funding more deprivation or more land theft, because it is wrong, it is inhuman, and it violates rights, both human and economical rights of people. And anybody with influence listening to this, please send this message. It's time these atrocities stop. They are not helping anyone except capitalism, and as Mordecai said about carbon trading, which is all wrong, or 30 by 30, which no one knows. The people that will be affected do not know what 30 by 30 mean, or the government or the states that have passed that one have not communicated that kind of message to the local peoples, to indigenous communities that will eventually be affected by this decision. So it is time a refresher is made to rethink conservation and not protectionism as we go into this year 2023 and even in the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Yannick. I think that's absolutely right, and as you say, tourism is so intricately bound up with this. People are constantly being evicted and thrown off their land, but tourists are continuing to being welcomed in. If you want to get involved in Survival's campaigns and to be kept informed about what's happening in the name of conservation, including with the Maasai, and how you can take action in support of Indigenous peoples, you can subscribe to our emails. That's the best way of making sure that you're kept up to date with everything that's going on. So please click the link to subscribe, which is pinned in the comments section. So we're now going to go to Fiore Longo, who's going to talk about 30 by 30 and the dangers of nature-based solutions, including carbon credits. She's also going to explain why 2023 is a critical year for Indigenous rights in conservation and climate change. Thanks, Fiore.
Hello, and hello to everyone there. Well, first of all, I want to, I would like to say something about why, not just because why this is an important year, but why we should care about what I'm going to explain you. We know already, because as Sophie told it, that 2023 is a critical year because the attack on Indigenous people's lands and rights is going to be dramatic. But why we should care about it. And I think that it's very important to keep in mind that this attack that is going to happen in the name of conservation is going to be supported and funded with our money, the money of our governments here in Europe. I am living in Europe. The money of our conservation organizations that have the headquarters in Europe, in the United States, for example, WWF and others. It's going to be supported by the money of the corporations here in Europe that want to compensate their emissions, as I'm going to explain. And it's also going to be supported, and it is supported right now and nourished by the imaginary that here in the Western world we have about conservation. It's important to understand that the responsibility of these abuses is here in Europe and in the United States, in the global North, and it's important for us to, that's why it's important for us to decolonize conservation and also to listen to what the speakers here have to say, because there are things that we can do to stop it. The first thing, the first reason why we think this is going to be a critical year in 2023 is the approval in Montreal of the 30 by 30 plan. Survival International has been campaigning against this plan for years, simply because it's going to be the biggest land grab in history. The idea is to set aside the 30% of the planet for nature protection. this sounds like a good idea. I'm sure there are a lot of people that are listening to us are thinking, what is the problem to set aside for conservation the 30% of the land? Well, the truth is that this is not going to be good, neither for nature, neither for climate, neither for the people that are living in that land. The land that is going to be set aside is not any land. It's probably the most biodiverse places in the world. That was the places that should be put under conservation are the places that have more biodiversity. Those places, of course, are not the Buckingham Palace. Those places are in the global south, specifically indigenous people's land, because the 80% of biodiversity is in indigenous people's land. The 80% of biodiversity. It sounds surreal that all the biodiversity, most of the biodiversity is in indigenous people's land, and nevertheless, they are being excluded from their lands in the name of conservation. So knowing that these lands are not empty, these are the lands of indigenous peoples, creating protected areas to set aside for nature protection, it's going to mean that the people that are living there are going to lose access to their land. This is even more tragic if we just think about how indigenous peoples live, how important the land is for them. The land is not just a place where they're going to take whatever they need to nourish their families, to feed their families, whether hunting or fishing or practicing agriculture. The land is also what where they have, I would say, a spiritual connection to the land. Land is sacred. The land is the place where they buried their ancestors. The land is the place where they teach their kids to be who they are. So the plan to set aside places for conservation, evicting people, are going to destroy these people. We sometimes call it genocide. And this is what is happening with the Maasai, for example. With the people being evicted, the land is not going to be protected, because the land is rich in biodiversity, because indigenous people have been taking care, have been doing things to protect the environment, nourish the environment by doing whatever they do to survive. There is an interconnection. There is ecosystems are made by humans and are made by animals and plants, and the interaction. And this is very important to keep in mind. When those people are being evicted, at the same time, protected areas are under the management of conservation NGOs, like, for example, WWF, or governments, that the only goal they have is to make money. So they will allow mass tourism, with hundreds or millions or thousands of tourists being allowed to get inside these protected areas. While and it's actually quite shocking to go to these places, especially in Africa and Asia, and see tourists that are welcome in jeeps and hotels and luxury hotels and restaurants inside areas, and at the same time, living sustainable, are being evicted. So we have this mass tourism that is welcome, trophy hunting is welcome, and sometimes also extractive industries are welcome inside this protected area. Evidence show that indigenous territories, so when indigenous people have the control over their land, are performing better in terms of biodiversity protection than protected areas. Because when people feel empowered to protect their own land, and they have the right to do it, of course, they do it better. So we know already that evicting people is not going to be good for the people itself, but it's, as I say, it's not good for nature. Indigenous peoples are the best guardians of the natural world, and every scientific evidence is, of course, showing the same. At the same time, protecting the 30% of the land and keep polluting and destroying the other 70% is not going to solve, or, of course, of biodiversity crisis. The only way to solve the biodiversity crisis is to tackle the real drivers of biodiversity loss. That is not by coincidence, that nothing to do with indigenous peoples, but are here in our way of life. For example, overconsumption. If we keep consuming as we are doing, we will need more resources, and we are, as we are doing, destroying nature. The worst thing of the 30% is also the way that they are thinking to fund it, because part of the money is also going to come from climate mitigation. And here is the second very important factor that is going to be key in destroying indigenous peoples' land and life in the next year. no one can deny climate change by now. So corporations are just pushing out, and the corporations and the conservation industry are just pushing out all sorts of false solutions. Among these one, nature-based solutions. The idea is that nature can save us from climate change. So the only thing we need to do is not changing our way of life, not reducing our emissions, is just protecting other people's lands. That means creating more protected areas or planting trees somewhere else. Of course, this is false. There are several scientific studies showing this. Most of these carbon credits, as they are called, projects, are a scam. But the question again that we have to raise is like, why indigenous peoples and other local communities living in those lands that are going to be transforming protected areas, or they are going to be places to plant trees, have to pay the price for an environmental and a climate crisis they didn't cause. As survival, what we are trying to do is to place the responsibility where the responsibility should be. It is here, it's our way of life that is destroying indigenous peoples' land and life, that is destroying our planet. And we are the ones who need to carry that responsibility. Our governments keep pooling money to conservation NGOs, among which WWF, whose CEO is the ex-CEO of, whose president is the former CEO of Coca-Cola. These are the solutions that our governments are proposing, is just giving more money to the same people that cause environmental destruction. It's time to stop this, and it's time to decolonize conservation.
Thanks so much, Fio. And I think it's really clear what an important year this is going to be, and how important it is that we really take action and don't allow these protected areas under 30 by 30 and the carbon credits to just carry on in the same way they have been, ignoring the rights of indigenous peoples and abusing those peoples and using militarization to drive them off those lands. We're now going to see a short video about 30 by 30 just to really explain a bit more.
Dear humanity, governments, big conservation NGOs, and the most polluting companies are promoting a dangerous plan. They claim it will help stop climate change and environmental destruction. It won't. It will make them worse. They want to turn 30% of the planet into protected areas, but that will involve the theft of vast areas of indigenous peoples' lands. Indigenous lands stolen for protected areas are militarized and controlled by fear. The people whose lands have been taken are persecuted, abused, tortured, and even murdered. So the 30% plan won't even protect nature because it will destroy indigenous peoples, the best guardians of the natural world. It also diverts attention from the real causes of biodiversity loss and climate change. The exploitation of natural resources for profit and growing overconsumption driven by the global north. So who stands to profit from this scheme? Governments and polluting corporations who carry on business as usual, and conservation NGOs who partner with them for money and will earn millions from managing the land and selling carbon credits. While indigenous peoples, those least responsible for the ecological crisis, will pay the price. But all humanity will suffer. Together, we must end this plan, the biggest land grab in history. Join the fight to stop the 30%.
Okay, so remember, if you've got any questions, please write them in the comments section or in the chat box, and please do remember to sign up to receive our emails so you can find out about more webinars, more actions, how you can help campaign against the things that are abusing the rights of indigenous peoples. We're now going to hear from Abdourahamane, who's going to talk about fortress conservation, colonial conservation, and how this won't help us solve the climate crisis.
Hi everyone, I'm really happy to be talking with you today. I would like to thank Survival International for inviting me to speak, and I'm really happy to hear the interesting talks given by the other speakers. So we have already heard from the other speakers some of the ways in which colonial ideas manifest today and how colonialism shows up in conservation, particularly in things like fortress conservation. I would like to continue this theme, but also look at climate change and the biodiversity crisis and suggest that it is only through decolonizing the conservation and environmental movement that we'll ever be able to tackle them. Colonization is now only just being recognized as a cause of climate change and biodiversity loss in mainstream environmental cycles. Even though indigenous people have been fighting for the recognition for a long time, we are now seeing that former colonies of European powers are now experiencing the worst of climate chaos, despite contributing very little to global emissions. So just to add a bit of background to how colonial ideas about land and the environment impact us today. Colonial violence resulted in the displacement and marginalization of local communities in favor of Europeans who now view themselves as the rightful owners of the land. And colonial ideas about land and property ownership became central to European imperialism. This is the belief that in order to own land, it must be made profitable. So it's all about the profit. As indigenous people did not hold these views, Europeans believed they were not entitled to the land. We can see this extractive model as the primary driver of climate change that continues today. The tragedies of colonialism are well documented, but the destruction of indigenous tradition resulted direct loss of sustainable land management. Colonization impact on the environment and wildlife on the continent was very tragic. The most obvious example of this is the massive decline in elephant population who, despite having been hunted prior to colonization in very small numbers, they were reduced from between 3 to 5 million to around 400,000 at the time of independence. We also see this in places like the Congo, where the Belgian desire for rubber resulted in millions of deaths during colonialism. Humans and animals alike were both exploited and murdered in the pursuit of profit under the imperial mission. The practice of exploiting land and wildlife and then conserving the land was central to European understanding of conservation. Species were pushed to extinction due to European hunting habits. This model of plunder and then attempt to save what is left is still seen on the continent, along with the mentality that something can only be worth protecting if they hold a monetary value. If you think of the debate about farming rhinos for their horns as an example, fortress conservation is a primary example of how colonial ideas manifest now in conservation, but we also see this in the debate about hunting. While subsistence hunting is now rebranded as poaching, hunting by Europeans and Americans is branded conservation. Trophy hunting or hunting iconic species for sport in exchange for money is branded as useful to conservation, a way to manage numbers. But the distinction between the poacher and the hunter is one based almost exclusively on skin color. Socioeconomic reasons for poaching are ignored, and the historic displacement of indigenous communities in favor of conservation are dismissed as a potential cause of hostility. This distinction is having an extremely negative impact on communities who are subjected to military tactics in order to protect these animals from poaching, while shooting them for sport is protected as a form of conservation. I will summarize by saying that research shows that areas managed by indigenous population results in a slow rate of biodiversity loss. Therefore, the restoration of indigenous land management and not their displacement in favor of fortress conservation and green militarization is central to the fight to protect wildlife and the environment. A colonial conservation model hurts indigenous people, but it also hurts biodiversity, the species we are hoping to protect, and the environmental movement. Conservation in Africa has a dark history as a colonial tool for land grabbing and resource extraction, and only through acknowledging this and moving away from ineffective colonial ideals will we be able to restore biodiversity and tackle climate chaos. Yeah, I'm done. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Abdourahamane. And for anyone, welcome to anyone who's joining the webinar late. And just to remind people that we've got a lot of comments already coming in and a lot of questions, but if you have other ones, please do add them to the comments or chat box. And you can sign up also in the comments section with a link to sign up and receive information from Survival and be kept updated on the campaigns. I'm going to also just talk myself a little bit now about how the similar violence and evictions that are happening in protected areas in other parts of the world that people have been talking about today are also happening in Asia. And I'm going to talk a bit about what happens to the Adivasi people, the indigenous people in India's tiger reserves, particularly giving the example of the Jenu Kuruba who live in Nagahole Tiger Reserve and National Park in southern India. An estimated 20,000 Jenu Kuruba have already been illegally evicted in the name of conservation, and many of these evictions have been supported by the US-based Wildlife Conservation Society, known as WCS. Guards harass, threaten, and even kill Jenu Kuruba people who, far from being a threat to the tiger, actually worship it as a god. The Jenu Kuruba say, look at the way the Forest Department does conservation, and they laugh at how it's done. They say, look, the guards are frightened of the tiger. They won't even go near a tiger without a gun. But we have lived alongside the tiger, we've coexisted with them for generations, and we also worship them. So who is better at protecting the tiger, us or them? Yet the Forest Department unleashes a brutal campaign to force the Jenu Kuruba out of their forest, using threats, violence, filing false cases against those who protest, and also by making false promises about all the supposed benefits they'll get of healthcare and schools and things that they'll get if they move out of the forest. But these promises rarely, if ever, materialize. And we're going to show a video of a Jenu Kuruba woman talking about how miserable their lives have been since they were evicted from their forest home.
ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಖುಷಿಯಾಗಿರ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೋ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನಮಗೆ ಈಗ ನೋಡಿ ಕರೆಂಟ್ ಕರೆಂಟ್ ಇಲ್ಲ ಒಂದು ಮನೆ ಕಂದಾಯ ಅದು ಇದು ನಾವು ಏನು ಕಟ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಈಗ ನಮಗೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಈಜಿಯಾಗಿದ್ದು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಬಂದು ಈಗ ತುಂಬ ಕಷ್ಟ ನಮಗೆ ಈಗ ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಂದು ದುಡ್ಡಲ್ಲೇ ಆಗಬೇಕು ನಾವು ಏನು ಮಾಡೋದು ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಕರೆಂಟ್ ಏನಿಲ್ಲ ನಮ್ಮ ಕಾಡು ಒಳಗಡೆ ಬೆಂಕಿ ಆಯಿತು ನಾವಾಯಿತು ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿತ್ತು ಅಂದರೆ ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ ಹಂಗೆಲ್ಲ ನನಗೆ ಈಗ ತುಂಬ ಕಷ್ಟ ನಮಗೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಬಂದು ನಮಗೆ ತುಂಬ ಕಷ್ಟ ಅಲ್ಲಿರೋದಿಗೆ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಕಷ್ಟ ಇತ್ತಿಲ್ಲ ಏನು ನಮಗೆ ಯಾರು ಬಂದು ಕೇಳೋರಿಲ್ಲ ಮಾಡೋರಿಲ್ಲ ನಾವು ಹೆಂಗೆ ಇದ್ದೋ ಹಂಗೆ ಖುಷಿಯಾಗಿ ಇದ್ದೋ ನಾವಲ್ಲಿ ಇಲ್ಲಂತ ಗಣಸು ಸಿಗ್ತಾರೆ ನಮಗೆ ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ ತಂದು ಈಗ ಈ ಥರ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನ ಫಾರೆಸ್ಟವರು ಒಳ್ಳೆ ಜಾಗ ಕೊಡ್ತೀವಿ ಒಳ್ಳೆ ಮನೆ ಕೊಡ್ತೀವಿ ಅಂತೆಲ್ಲ ಹೇಳಿ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನ ಇದು ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು ನಿಜ ಹೇಳ್ಬೇಕು ತಾನೆ ನಾವು ಸುಳ್ಳುಗಳು ಹೇಳ್ಬಾರ್ದು ಲಾಸ್ಟಿಗೆ ನಾವು ಚಿಕ್ಕಾಕೊಡ್ಬಿಡ್ತೀವಿ ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತಾಡಿ ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ನಾವು ಸುಳ್ಳು ಹೇಳೋ ಇದೇ ಇಲ್ಲ ಕಾಡಲ್ಲಿರೋರಿಗೆ ಅವ್ರಿಗೇನು ನಾವು ಹೇಳಬೇಕು ನಾವು ಈಗ ಇಷ್ಟು ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ ಪರಿಸ್ಥಿತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ ನೀವು ಅದಾಗಿ ಬರಬೇಡ ಅವ್ನ ಮಾತು ಕಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ಬರಬೇಡ ನೀವು ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ನನಗೆ ತುಂಬ ಕಷ್ಟದಲ್ಲಿ ಇವಾಗ ಇದ್ದೇವೆ ನಾವು ಅದನ್ನು ಯಾರು ಬಂದು ಏನು ಎತ್ತ ಕೇಳೋರು ಯಾರೂ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅದು ಈಗ ನೀವು ಬಂದು ನಮಗೆಲ್ಲ ತಿಳಿಸಿದ್ದು ಅಷ್ಟಿಗೆ ನನ್ನ ಮಾತೆ
So, like the stories we've heard from the other speakers, this is all underpinned by a colonial conservation policy that treats Adivasi people like the Jenu Kuruba as backward and as destroyers of the land that they've protected for generations. And it assumes that the only way to protect the forest is to kick out the indigenous peoples and to bring in outside experts to do the conservation. Although the Jenu Kuruba always say, well, these so-called experts, they come and to protect the forest, and they have to ask us questions all the time because they know nothing about our forest. Hundreds of thousands of Adivasis, including the Jenu Kuruba, have been torn from their homes. Yet, of course, as Yannick was saying in Tanzania, fee-paying tourists are welcomed in. Last year, 2 Jenu Kuruba men were killed by forest guards. One, Basava, died in December from his injuries after he was shot the year before. He said that he was attacked because he defended his sister after she was being harassed by guards. Another, Kariappa, who died after being beaten and tortured by guards while he was being questioned for hunting deer meat. The guards came to his family before he was arrested and said, if you don't tell us where he is, we're going to burn down your houses. These are the sort of abuses the Jenu Kuruba and Adivasis across India and indigenous peoples across protected areas are facing. The Jenu Kuruba who have been evicted in the past but now want to go back to their forests because now they have a better understanding of their rights and they know that actually the eviction was illegal, and often they're not even told that they're allowed to stay, that they have a choice to stay, they're just told you have to go. So now when they are trying to return, they are harassed and beaten. They're not even allowed to go back into the forest to worship their deities or to bury their dead. But the Jenu Kuruba are incredibly strong and inspiring, and they're demanding their rights to stay in their forest and for those who've been evicted to be allowed to return. They're holding protests on their land, they're going to meetings in Bangalore, the nearest big city where WWF is supporting a meeting to just protest against the whole colonial model of conservation. And they're also challenging the very creation of the tiger reserve on their land because it happened without their consent. They also wrote to the US government because the US Fish and Wildlife Service was giving a grant, had given a grant to WCS to help facilitate so-called voluntary relocations in southern India. And the Jenu Kuruba made it clear to the US government in their letter that they would never leave their forest, and that this grant was aiding and abetting the government and WCS's plans to evict us from our forests. And this was one of the examples of the colonial nature of conservation that was sent to the US government, along with the exposure of human rights violations funded by WWF in Africa and other parts of Asia, backed up by thousands of emails from survival supporters that helped lead to the drafting of a landmark new bill on conservation funding in the US. The bill seeks to ensure that the US Fish and Wildlife Service cannot fund conservation projects where gross human rights violations occur. And any project that wants to get US Fish and Wildlife Service funding has to have the free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. And there's some other increased improvements in standards on the way Indigenous peoples and local communities must be treated, etc. The bill passed the committee stage and was voted through the US House of Representatives last year. But because of the election at the end of the year, it will have to go back again and be voted again on again in 2023. However, last year it had bipartisan support from both parties and passed with an overwhelming majority. So we are really hopeful that it will progress smoothly through the House and Senate this year. The bill isn't perfect, but it is a major success for the campaign to decolonize conservation. It established a vital precedent that will be difficult for conservation organizations and their international funders to ignore. It also shows just how much impact pressure from public opinion, of people sending letters and emailing, the courage of people like the Jenu Kuruba to speak out about what's happening to them, how much of a difference that can make. And it's a clear signal that times are changing for the likes of WWF and WCS. Now that's quite a positive and slightly surprising sometimes to have a positive thing to say, but it really, you can see that difference and what a difference that could make if other funding bodies, other governments were to take on a similar sort of legislation. So we've now got some questions that are coming in from people who've been watching, and please remember, if you've still got questions, do add them to the chat, and also remember to sign up to our email so you can take action and get involved. Because as you saw with people lobbying the US government and people doing other lobbying campaigns, it really does make a difference. So it really is important that people sign up so they can find out what's happening and how to get involved. So we have the first question, which is from somebody from the UK who asks, what tends to happen to people who are kicked off their lands? And I wonder whether, Yannick, you wanted to say something based on the recent experience of what's been happening in Tanzania.
Can you please repeat that question?
Yes, sorry, of course. So what tends to happen to people when they're kicked off their lands? What actually happens to them?
Or what actually happened to them? As I said, people are kicked off their land. The land they've used for grazing, for economic reasons, and also for cultural reasons, and now they are kicked out of their land. It simply means access to that land, for whatever reason, is prohibited, no longer allowed. So people become refugees, people become economically poor, they are unable to support themselves, to buy food, send their children to school, support themselves for medical aid. So you shift from capable economically and socially to become suddenly a poor person, and mostly refugees. Sometimes what is happening is that you get branded so kinds of names, so kind of legal issues are kept on you if you resist that movement. Some people become branded as non-citizens of the country, and especially what happened in Tanzania is that the Maasai that resisted are termed as non-Tanzanians, they are Kenyans. They are branded also as enemies of the state, which means you can become prosecuted anytime. But what actually happened in Loliondo during the eviction, about 24 leaders and people, ordinary citizens, were arrested, detained for 6 months for illegal charges. 72 were arrested and detained for branded being non-Tanzanians. And if you maintain access to that area, whatever property you have, being livestock or any other kind of property, they are captured and confiscated by the state. And so, like for example, already about 3,000 cows have been confiscated, sold by the state, and suddenly those people have become completely poor. So this is what is happening. A lot of branding, illegal, and forced displacement and arrests, and some people become completely refugees. Like what is happening, most people went to Kenya as refugees, and just a few returned.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anybody else want to add anything? Fio, do you want to add anything about maybe the more long-term effects as well of people who've been away from their lands for a longer time?
Yes. What actually happened with the people when they're evicted is that they lose everything that has a meaning for them. It's the same thing that would happen to us if we are evicted from our house, or from the place where we find meaning. And I have visited several communities in India, for example. Sophie was talking about tiger reserves, which is also another very dramatic example of fortress conservation. And usually in India, sometimes they are just evicted, some other times they are offer money to leave. And the very, very sad thing is that most of the indigenous people that are being evicted, well, they don't know a lot about market prices. So they have this money that is very little, is nothing, and then they are being cheated when they go to the outside the forest to buy land, and they end up buying land that actually is not fertile and they can't grow anything. And they are put inside these houses. Sometimes they are giving money, sometimes they are put in what they are called resettled villages, which is also what happened to the Maasai in another area called Gorongoro, where they are pushed out and offered to go to these resettled sites that are horrible. The houses are in concrete, where indigenous houses usually are not in concrete, because of course otherwise will be very hot. They are without any kind of social services. They don't have schools, they don't have hospitals, they don't have clinics, or whatever else they need to live their life, and are just there in these places where they can't feed their families because they don't have, the land is not good. They can't access to the forest anymore, for example, for the medicinal plants or for other food. So most of the cases, they are starving. I have seen people that were dying because they didn't have food. Some other cases, they have to work for money, which is also sometimes a new thing for them, sometimes not, but sometimes a new thing. So they end up working in, for example, in Congo, happen a lot with the baka. They end up working for other people in the farms, and then they are paid with alcohol. So what we are actually seeing is a completely destruction of them as people, which is, of course, extremely dramatic. This is what happened when the people are pushed out, in my experience.
Thank you, Fiore. So we have another question. Somebody's asking, and I think Mordecai maybe will go to you first on this. Evictions, they say, evictions are the most obvious form of colonial conservation, but can you also talk a little about the dangers of so-called community-led conservation and how this can mask actual colonial conservation?
Yes, Sophie. As you said, evictions are the most overtly visible impact, but the cultural impacts are huge. It's detachment, as Fiore alluded to. It's detachment from ancestral lands, detachment from sacred lands, that lands that are sacred to them, and identity as well. And the long-term economic impact it's like economic genocide or disenfranchisement, because pastoralism, if I talk about pastoralism, it's not just a lifestyle, it's a production system, it's a livelihood. When this is changed and they're put into a situation where they're now serving the cause of maybe some tourism project, they're serving a tourism investor. Tourism, they move instantly from resilience and self-sufficiency to servitude. And why it's called tourism is probably the worst business one could get into, because it's subject to so many factors. Like those who are dependent on tourism have suffered terribly during the COVID pandemic lockdown. Yet those who are producing livestock kept their livelihood, because people would still eat meat, still drink milk, they still sell livestock. But tourism died regardless of how well you are running your business. But this is not a mistake. This is intentional. People who are self-sufficient economically are not easy to control. They need to impoverish people in order to make them controllable and create servitude. The servitude cannot survive with pastoralism. So this is why all over Africa and other parts of the world, conservation interests are deliberately trying to destroy pastoralism. And this is something that flies under the radar, and this is what our human rights bodies, a lot of activist groups, etc., and survival are finding it very difficult, because they're not researching it in fine enough detail. But the long-term effects of this will be catastrophic, especially in areas like northern Kenya, where there's a proliferation of small arms. When you end up with people who are disenfranchised, poor, and have nothing except a gun, it will go bad. It's not a matter of if, but when.
Thanks, Mordecai. And could you also say just a few words about the sort of when colonial conservation is dressed up as community-led conservation? Would you like to say something about that too?
Yes. Community-led conservation is a complete fallacy. Let me make that clear at this point. There is no truth to it, because communities that live in areas around wildlife, they don't, and most indigenous African communities even have a word for conservation, because that was just their lifestyle. That was just how they live. You keep the river clean because your kids are drinking water from it, etc. So when they talk of community-led conservation, this is contrived. First of all, they destroy existing community structures like the systems of elders, etc., and create what they call committees. So a community suddenly has a chairman and a secretary and a treasurer and a committee member, board member, or whatever it is. This creates a situation where they can legally in quotes, sign off. 5 people can legally sign off the birthright of the entire community of 20,000, 30,000 people. And the document will be legal as far as all the existing laws are concerned. So this is what they call community-led. So it is not led by the community, because the community leaders are chosen by external players and are financed by external players. The community themselves are not universally consulted. And these agreements are long-term agreements. The longest I've seen is 40 years. If you look in many areas of Africa, 40 years is 2 generations. There's a kid who will be born under that agreement, grow to an adult, and have his own children who will grow up to adulthood within that agreement, which they had no part in signing, which they were never consulted about, but determines their livelihoods from everything from the river where they can fetch water to the grasslands they can graze, or to where they can build their homes. And it is a most egregious violation of human rights at a grand scale.
Thanks very much, Mordecai. That was really clear. We have a question for Abdourahamane now. Can you explain the difference between a hunter and a poacher?
I think the difference on that is basically skin color, because a poacher is basically labeled as a poacher since the European find values in exploiting this land and the animals. But as an African living in this land, there are many tribes that survive in either herding or like being around animals. But the poachers are defined by external people like Europeans or Americans. But the other side, where the hunter, who is glorified, the conservation movement, which is somehow accepted by the conservation movement that we see around, is basically doing like what we as African, we don't like engage in something like that. So here we see a poacher or someone who like hunts to survive as a normal person. But in the West now, they're seeing like a hunter who comes to Africa to kill animals is viewed as like someone who is saving conservation. So it's a big problem in this within the conservation movement, I believe. So I hope they will be able to make a difference in this, to really like not glorify these hunters that are coming from outside to destroy the animals and our environment, and also try to make it sound like they're helping us. So I hope that will be a better explanation of my understanding of this issue.
Thank you. Yes, that was really clear. So we have a question from someone from France. Maybe Fiore, you'd like to answer this one. As a European person, they said, what can we do to act? Are there companies that we should be boycotting or particular messages to circulate?
I love when they ask that question. Yes, there is a lot. There is a lot we could do. First of all, Survival International, which is the organization I'm representing today, does a lot of work of any kind, lobbying, advocacy, and we need people. We need to have a lot of supporters in order to make an impact. For example, when the Maasai eviction happened, we alert, of course, all the European governments that are giving money to Tanzania. One thing, if there is just an organization like Survival alerting them. Another thing is when there are hundreds or thousands of millions of people sending them emails. These make a difference. The goal of Survival is to radically change public opinion, because we believe that it's it's you, the people that are listening to us, that can actually make the big change. And we have campaigns and in which we ask people to take action. So if you subscribe to our newsletter or follow us in social media, you will find things to do. The other thing that is important is that there are indigenous organizations like Yannick here, and could tell more about what you could do to support the Maasai. There are indigenous organizations, there are indigenous people that are trying and resisting with all their strength against the attacks of fortress conservation. And Yannick can tell you more about what, for example, you can do to support the Maasai. And the third thing, so there are survival indigenous organizations that I recommend you also to support. But there is also, very importantly, the fact that I was explaining before, that is our money that contribute to our things. So stop giving money to organizations like WWF, Frankfurt Zoological Society, African Parks, WCS, are ways to give them a clear message, writing to them, explaining, we are not going to give you any more money because you are violating indigenous people's rights. These are all good things that we can do. Of course, the change is not, as I explained, will come from individuals. It will come from all of us as a society if we are all together fighting for this. That's why Survival is trying to build up a movement to decolonize conservation. And another thing, the fourth thing, is the education. What I mean with this, we were talking before about the difference between poachers and hunters. Yannick was talking about the imaginary of nature, the idea of imagining nature that is wild. All of these stereotypes that have an impact on the life of people come from us, from filmmakers or journalists or book texts or films. So there is a lot of educational work to do. And Survival has been, for example, working on a beautiful guide to decolonize conservation that I invite you to read. And so there is the necessity for people to share the material we are producing. We have also tribal voice videos, we call them. They're testimony of indigenous peoples in first line that are experiencing it. So this is something very, for us, very important, that people share our material. And for example, the video of the Maasai that Yannick showed before, it's very important. These have an impact because the government don't want bad press, want to keep their investment. So if we all are sharing this kind of information and taking action when necessary, it's of course very, very important.
Great, thanks, Fio. And Yannick, did you want to add something about how people can support the Maasai and what people can do from Europe and elsewhere?
Yes. One thing Europeans could do, especially if you are from France, is to write to UNESCO. UNESCO is supposed to protect cultures of indigenous peoples all over the world. But now it's like the other way around. It is like UNESCO supporting evictions and displacement of different cultures, especially the Maasai in Tanzania. So one thing is for people to write more letters demanding UNESCO to protect the rights of communities and the other cultures because it is within their mandate. That's one thing. Secondly, of course, writing and speaking to governments that support this kind of violent and fortress conservation, and mostly because it seems like the German government is supporting conservation, colonial, violent, whatever kind. They don't care what happens in the process, so long as it is now termed the conservation of protected area. The German government supports that, and I think they should know from the people in Europe that what they are doing is wrong, and they should stop it. So that's the second thing. The third thing is to support the Maasai and the other indigenous people that are displaced regularly, so they don't succumb to the pressure of poverty. At least so they're able to recover, they're able to protect whatever lands has remained, and they're able to support themselves and their families with education and other needs. And by doing that, we are able to stabilize an indigenous culture that is so useful and so important for conservation, like the rest of the speakers have said. But to put pressure on the European government and the American government is so crucial right now, so they can, not only the Maasai, but other communities all over the world that are suffering because of their support and the pressure from America and Europe. So the pressure from citizens, like what Fiore said, unite and put pressure on those units like UNESCO and the governments to stop their support to very cruel conservation.
Thank you, Yannick. And maybe we should just mention German government funding here, because the German government funds an enormous amount of conservation abuses, including in Tanzania. And I think it's really important that we don't forget them as well and their responsibility. So anyone listening from Germany, please write to your government, expose what they're doing, and ask them to stop. Okay, so I have another question. This is a I don't know who wants to answer this one, so I shall read it and take volunteers. Is there not a way to protect areas for conservation whilst also protecting the rights of indigenous people on those lands? Surely it's not 30 by 30 that's the issue, but how this would be implemented. Who would like to answer this?
Maybe
Mordecai?
I can. Yeah, there is a way by leaving them alone. That is actually a possibility. These places have magnificent biodiversity, ecosystems, production systems, which have existed for thousands of years. Why can't they be left alone? The impetus behind the 30 by 30 is not biodiversity protection. Biodiversity protection is the excuse, but the impetus is capitalism. The need to take ownership of those areas. And the need to take ownership of those areas is what we are describing as colonial conservation or colonial. And unlike imperial colonialism, those who need to take ownership are not nations now. They're corporations. And the new colonialists are corporations and capitalists, and their agents are conservation organizations. So the way to conserve these areas is to leave them alone. If anyone is to do anything there, it should be to strengthen and improve the resilience of the people who have taken care of these resources for so many generations. So it's not, that question is very common. People keep saying, what's the alternative? The alternative is to go away and leave it alone. That's the alternative. And we keep to keep tourists, these romantic tourist notions out of the whole discussion. Because I always say, if someone doesn't want to see Maasai people or Maasai livestock, don't come to Kenya or Tanzania. We don't want you here. Because nobody goes to China and says they saw too many Chinese people. No one goes to India and says they saw too many Indian people. It's only Africa where people have this notion of the territorial notion, where you have beautiful landscapes, wonderful wildlife, and no people. That's what fallacy is. So the easiest way is to leave it alone, and let's start from what the people there want, what their aspirations are.
Great, thanks so much, Mordecai.
Can I add to that question?
Yannick?
To that answer? Yeah,
Yep, of course.
One thing that we must do right now is to remove protection from conservation. That's one thing we must do, because people confuse conservation and protectionism and think by protecting or creating protected areas is conserving, which is completely wrong. Conservation is happening every day, everywhere where communities and indigenous peoples live. If today we take an inventory of biodiversity presence in community and indigenous people's lands, we may find that it is even bigger than what it is now protected in the protected cycles. So that's one thing that we should do. We should remove protection from conservation. Secondly, tourism, because what the governments and corporations and what have you claim that conservation or tourism is probably the biggest source of income to protect or to support conservation in the world, which is completely wrong. So I would say tourism should support or should become as meaningful to communities and indigenous peoples as it is to the government. And the government should allow tourism to move freely and benefit people freely without their interference and without their conditions. Because tourism, and this is what also the North should learn, tourism or protection, conservation, tourism conservation areas in the North just happens arbitrarily, and it should happen likewise in indigenous communities' lands. So tourism should be allowed to flow freely and benefit people significantly as it does the government. Thank you.
Thank you, Mordecai. Does anyone else, Abdourahamane, would you like to add anything?
Yeah.
Fiore, would
So,
after that.
sorry. I think by including indigenous people in the process, because indigenous people are naturally the out in trying. That's like their nature. That's the environment they live in. They are naturally supposed to, or they're conscious about what they're supplement. So you can't come and try to do some help out in someone's territory and kick them out of their territory. So in order to really do this, you need to let them lead you, not you coming to lead them in the way. So that's what I think I wanted to add on that.
Thanks very much. And Fiore, you just wanted to say something too.
Yeah, but I am conscious of time, so don't worry. I think it was exhaustive what they say. Thank you.
Okay. So somebody has asked, is there any way to more specifically identify the perpetrators beyond generally terms like governments? Fiore, do you want to answer that?
Yes, I like this question. Of course, the perpetrators have a name also. So there are two things that differentiated. To differentiate. One thing, of course, is the park rangers. So when we talk about abuses and militarization of conservation, just to explain it very concretely, it means that there are people, park rangers, that protect the protected areas. So they are the guys who are not allowing anyone to get in, and they are shooting or abusing whoever is trying to get in, of course. There is also the police in some cases, with the case of the Maasai. But, and this for me has a but, we don't think in survival that of course they are responsible, the park rangers are responsible of the abuses too, but the entire responsibility shouldn't go on them. They are most of the time people from the local communities that are being paid, and they are told to do this job. The real responsibility goes on the conservation organizations. The conservation organizations, for example, WWF, African Parks, WCS, and I keep repeating this because these are the guys who are really the ones accountable. WWF pays the salary of the rangers, the cars, the fuel for the cars, the phones of the rangers, the trainings, and these rangers are the more and more trained by private companies. Usually in these companies there are ex-special forces or ex-intelligence agents, or even the army, so former army, soldiers. And so these rangers are trained by these companies, and they are also being told in a lot of cases that they are going to get extra money that are called bonus of performance every time they arrest or they confiscate it. They confiscate food or for example, animals or meat of all sorts or whatever cows. So conservation organizations, most of the time with taxpayers' money, so with EU money, USAID money, so money coming from the government agencies, are paying park rangers to arrest people. They're paying the training. They tell the rangers, you have to arrest pastoralists who go inside the Serengeti National Park because this is illegal. So who is the responsibility to? Is the park ranger that arrests the person and commit human rights abuses, or are these organizations who in the first place have stolen the land of indigenous peoples to create a national park or a tiger reserve, and they are paying the rangers, are training them and telling them who is the enemy and who have to be the target? And this is a very important question, because this model of conservation is actually targeting the wrong people. As a UN investigation put it, this kind of conservation is targeting the easiest targets, who are not the ones responsible for the environmental destruction, so the environmental destruction can go on. Because WWF paid the rangers to arrest the baka, but at the same time partnered with logging companies that are cutting down the forest. So the people that are accountable for this have names. It's called WWF, Frankfurt Zoological Society, WCS, African Parks. And I could go on with this, but I will stop here.
Thank you, Fiore.
If I may add,
Yep.
there, the biggest, those Fiore has named those involved in a lot of atrocities, but in terms of grabbing and acquisition of landscapes and seascapes, the Nature Conservancy stands head and shoulders above the rest.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Mordecai. Anyone else want to just come in on this? We just have a couple of minutes left, so otherwise I can go very quickly to the last question. So somebody has asked from France, what can be done to amplify your voices and make this, what's happening here, widely known? And the 30 by 30 project and fortress and colonial conservation as a whole shouldn't be seen as the solution. And we literally just have 2 minutes left, so if someone would like to answer very succinctly, that would be wonderful.
Question everything, I think. Scrutinize all claims or fundraising appeals. Ask them what they're doing in Africa versus what they're doing in America, doing in Europe. And I think it's just, don't fall for the feel-good that they're selling, the feel-good notions that they're selling. And I think keep talking about it, keep questioning it, and don't ever think that you're not an expert. This is a human issue. It's not biology, it's not chemistry, it's just humanity. And let's look past the fluffy toys and the nice reports and really ask questions, the way you question what you eat or the car you drive or what you drink and all that. So let's question this as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mordecai.
But also quickly, Survival International is running this kind of campaign globally, and I think people from France or Europe generally and America, please support this campaign. Join the main list, learn, and support what Survival International is doing, because there you will learn and there is where you will take action as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Yannick. Well, you've just said what I was going to say again. That's absolutely, because we'll be keeping people informed about what's happening when indigenous people's rights are being violated around the world in the name of conservation. And so please sign up. If you haven't already signed up, sign up to our to receive our emails, and then whenever awful atrocities are happening, for example, like when the Maasai were being shot at in Tanzania, and Survival, immediately informed the press and made sure that the Maasai's voices were being heard. And so it's really important to sign up, and then you'll hear about these things and what's happening and what action you can take. So I'd just like to thank everyone for joining this webinar across so many platforms, and also thank you to Groovy Gecko to allow this to happen. We've never been able to live stream in so many different ways and in so many places before. And enormous thanks to our speakers for sharing so much information. And I'm sure they've inspired everybody who's listening and inspiring all of us to get involved and to take action to decolonize conservation in 2023 and beyond. So please, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for caring about what's happening, and please do get involved, take action. As Mordecai said, don't believe the propaganda, look behind, ask the questions, and together we can really make sure that 2023 becomes a year where really the decolonizing conservation really begins to happen. Thanks so much everyone for joining us, and yeah, thank you, goodbye.